Another event, this one in Atlanta, and this is part of a string of events that have prompted more and more discussion about change within our police departments, reform for law enforcement, whether it's on the state or federal level. And it's not the first time we've come across this call. The question is it a little different this time? So let's bring in Dr. William Rosenberg for the discussion, professor of political science at Drexel University, tweeting at DRB Rosenberg. Bill, welcome back. Thanks for being here today.
Good morning.
It does seem that at times there are things that people agree on, and yet the details get in the way of anything substantive taking place. What is the challenge, and is this a challenge that we have seen play out before? It seems to me it is.
Well, I think right now what we're really facing is an issue of change. And the demonstrations that have been going on since George Floyd's murder are now going on into its 21st day. And in many ways, it seems remarkable that there has been this persistence of demonstrations. But on the other hand, one should recognize that it's probably not so surprising. We're really in a situation where there's been a long trail of abuses that have been taking place over decades, but it's been a situation where while the George Floyd murder was an important moment, since then we've had Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta the other night at the Wendys. We had the killing of Breonna Taylor. We had the Aubrey murder in Georgia, and as we go back in terms of the past, things like Eric Gardner, Freddie Gray, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, the list is really endless. And just for those who have a little sense of history, it's not just about the police doing these things, but society as a whole. If you go back to, for example, Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955.
Well, to that point, Ahmaud Arbery, he was not killed by police, nor was Trayvon Martin. He was killed by George Zimmerman. So
yes,
those were both
and I guess the point I'm
killings.
trying to make is that it's not just police, it's a societal issue. Many times the police, though, is involved, and in fact, in the Aubrey murder, there was a former policeman involved. So I think that's part of what my point is.
The police making it different, though, right? Just because, in this sense, they have the assent, if you will, of the governed, because they are the law enforcement, and you can't sue them. It's very difficult to bring them to court. And it's not to say that there is not racism outside of the police department, but the point is that the institution of law enforcement in this country is really being called into question today, I think.
That's an excellent point, and basically society has granted them sovereign power to maintain civil control of our daily lives. We give them special treatment and expect them to operate at a level that's appropriate. And in effect, many times they've failed to accomplish this. But I think one of the key points that I look at in this situation is how long will this series of protests last and what is its impact? And when I think about this situation, I think that one shouldn't be surprised that there's such great headwind in this because there's been so much abuse over time, even to the point where people who are demonstrating may have never demonstrated in their lives before and may be willing to take on the issue of the coronavirus, being in crowds, often without masks, which they could wear but don't. So there's quite a bit of personal involvement that people are having in saying enough is enough, that something has to happen. But the question is, what would be the turning point to have the demonstration stop? I think a lot of people were initially turned off by the violence, and not only of the police and the military, but also of some of the protesters who were looting or committing other acts. And while that's sort of died down, I think that did lead to the potential for some people to have backlash towards the movement, and also a cautiousness for potential supporters.
Yeah. The burning of the Wendys or setting it on fire was certainly one of those moments, because the question was, well, what did Wendys have to do with it other than being the site of this taking place? It wasn't like they encouraged this. But that said, I wonder, at the risk of sounding crassly political about this, what do the campaigns, the candidates say about this to get on the right side of the voter? They may or may not wind up getting on the right side of history, but the approach that the two presidential hopefuls are taking, President Trump, obviously, and former Vice President Joe Biden.
Well, I think you raise a very interesting question. I think that the issue for Donald Trump is almost a repeat of history if we go back to the 1960s, when the cities were on fire after a number of assassinations. The Nixon campaign seized on the concept of a law and order campaign, and a lot of people bought into that, and as a result, he was propelled to an election victory. I think Donald Trump is, in a sense, sort of banking a little bit on that to appeal to his base supporters. Donald Trump has not generally been reaching out to enlarge his base of support, but rather to promote his base of support so that they turn out for him on Election Day. The raw numbers often are not in favor of Donald Trump, but the Electoral College and the motivation of who's going to show up is very much something that he plays upon. On the Biden side, Biden has embraced this notion of dealing with the police, dealing with racism in the United States, has made claims that he is going to have a black Supreme Court justice. He has several women of color that are among the top candidates for his VP slot. And in effect, blacks, and particularly in South Carolina, propelled him to become the front runner and eventually now the potential nominee, all but a convention away from supporting it. So I think they're taking very different tactics. Their calculations about what they should do and how they should do it is different, but nonetheless, it certainly will play into the 2020 election.
Yeah, that's interesting when you mention that, because we know that President Trump is going to start getting back on the rally trail on Saturday. It was going to be Friday, now it's going to be Saturday. Joe Biden continues to campaign mostly either from his basement or other places where he's doing virtual town halls. And this seems to me, Bill, striking a contrast. And I'm not sure how this turns out, but that to me is a fascinating difference between the way the two of them are conducting this campaign.
Yeah, and I think that if you start, to look, the ads on TV are starting to come out, both by the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign. And I think that the Trump campaign is starting to push the notion of Joe Biden being out of touch. And I think at some point there's going to be a greater law and order message there. He's certainly promoting the law and order message and the use of the military to make sure everything stays, from his perspective, under control. But, we had this remarkable move in the past week or so with Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Miley, who came out and apologized for walking over to the church across from the White House in his military gear while military personnel were set to, protect the White House, but also to suppress the demonstrators. We had the letter from General Petraeus talking about the base name changes and how they're long overdue. We've seen Colin Powell come out and again state that he can't support the president and that the racism that's being promoted is a horrible act. So I think that we're seeing many people that you would not consider part of the, quote, liberal establishment coming out. And I think in many ways this, what I would call this George Floyd movement, while not a new thing, it's built on a history of many different acts, is beginning to educate and also accumulate support from non-traditional liberals who are moving more and more towards supporting change. And I think that change is very much focused right now on the police, but also on other societal problems like healthcare and education. So this will all play out for sure.
Dr. William Rosenberg. Bill, thanks as always for being here. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, you have a great day.
You too. Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, joining us to offer his thoughts on the change that he is seeing take place. There's systemic, there's specific, and, well, who knows how far it'll go. He is tweeting at Dr., as in doctor, at DRB Rosenberg, Rosenberg.